Over to Pete Harrison from Desegregate, Connecticut to do his presentation on Work, Live, Ride.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, seeing some yeses and heads nodding. Let me just share my screen here and pull up the presentation. Oops. All right.
Yeah.
All right, so give it. Don't want to spoil it. All right. Okay, so and just last reminder, or thing, can folks see my screen okay as well?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, thank you so much for having the meeting tonight and frankly having a joint meeting with everybody. We really appreciate the opportunity to give kind of a preview of what we're proposing in the legislative session starting today. And we are really interested in answering questions, getting some feedback, and getting a lay of the land on the ground from folks that are practitioners and leaders in communities. And I can share this presentation after with Chris, and we can get that out to folks as well. We're putting the final touches on the launch of our website for Work, Live, Ride and some other stuff, but so the public available information will be out shortly, but everything in here will be shareable, of course. All right, so my name is Pete Harrison. I'm the director of Desegregate Connecticut. I started officially a week before the session last year, so I had a little bit of a baptism by fire, but I've been involved in the organization going back to 2021. I'm originally from Avon, Connecticut, grew up there, was down in New York City doing a lot of housing and climate policy work for a very long time, just moved back up to Connecticut, renting a place up in Simsbury near my parents with my 9-month-old and my wife. So we are experiencing the housing crisis. We definitely could not find a home to buy. I'm not sure when that's going to happen, where that's going to happen. So this is something that I'm personally living and very excited to promote because I know that, hopefully I can benefit from it personally. A quick recap about Desegregate Connecticut. We are a pro-homes coalition of about 80 nonprofit groups and neighborhood groups from across the state, anything from affordable housing providers and advocates to climate groups, to transportation advocates, to anti-racism groups, you name it. We have got it represented in our coalition. And we believe very fundamentally in creating abundant and diverse kinds of homes and communities in Connecticut, both acknowledging the past of racial discrimination and economic segregation in Connecticut, how that's really informing a lot of the economic stagnation and demographic problems we're having in the state, and also as a means to solve the climate crisis in Connecticut that's obviously happening around us right now. So we really focus on land use reform and promoting economic prosperity, social inclusivity, and economic sustainability at all levels of government. We really have what we call an all-the-above approach to solving the housing crisis, certainly the economic stagnation and the climate crisis. We don't just take one approach. We don't just think one solution is part of it. So this all-the-above approach really means, number one, we need to build more homes and more kinds of homes, a diversity of options that really has been lacking in Connecticut. We want to act at all levels of government. I think probably better known for the state level stuff that we do, but really a lot of our work is actually activating pro-homes folks locally and getting them to advocate for their communities and see the positive changes that we all want to see. And finally, we want to work in and with diverse coalitions. We mentioned our coalition, but we're parts of other conversations around transportation, advocacy, climate advocacy, economic development, both at the state, the regional, and the local level. And we really see our lane as land use reform really touching a number of other intersectional issues. And we want to inform their work at the local and state level and also have our work informed by experts in other spaces as well. So, we're just one piece of the puzzle solving all these big problems and opportunities we have, but we think we're pretty good at what we do here. Just in the interest of time, I'm talking, of course, about Work, Live, Ride, our state level transit-oriented community proposal, but I thought it would actually be helpful to do a quick kind of last sessions learned from the previous short session earlier this past year now. We had introduced a bill, HB 5429, that was a bill about transit-oriented development. We call it transit-oriented communities to emphasize the community side of it. That bill was very simply based on a bill that had passed in Massachusetts with bipartisan support the previous year. It basically had called for a half-mile radius of fixed transit stations in Connecticut, so train stations or rapid bus stations, allowing for more density for homes at 15 homes per acre across all the different sort of 62 stations that fit under that. We had some affordability requirements. We had a couple different elements to it, carve outs for environmentally sensitive land and some other stuff. But we didn't get it out of committee, didn't pass, which I think nobody was really expecting in the election year. But there were some important lessons that we really internalized from conversations with folks like you guys, advocates at the state level and champions at all levels, where we really wanted to internalize some, I think, the good faith criticisms of the bill, some of the shortcomings that even we'd acknowledged. And number one on top of the list for us was, this pushback of what we'll call, local control and this idea of state mandates. That's really politically pretty hard to do. I understand why that's the case. There is a lot of local expertise and local insights. The state kind of comes in and doesn't necessarily provide a lot of resources to change things. And all of a sudden it's an unfunded mandate that can be difficult. We think very much that we want to see the state take a more active role in land use and think regionally and at the state level for the housing crisis and the economic crisis. But we think doing it from a mandate approach alienates a lot of folks that support us and these ideas, broadly speaking, philosophically, and created some soft opposition that we would really like to activate on a different platform this year. The second one that we'd heard quite a bit of was kind of this one size fits all narrative about this 15 homes per acre for every station. I think some of that was kind of bad faith. Some of it was kind of true for sure. We thought that 15 homes per acre was actually a relatively good bar to establish as a baseline. Obviously, cities can do more. Some communities might be a little bit uncomfortable with that density and want to do less. We were hoping to have that conversation in the session, but we didn't really have that chance. So we did recognize that very much that one size fits all narrative really hung out there and I think limited the ability for us to talk about some of the nuances that we'd really talked about. So this proposal that I'll introduce has a lot more nuance to it, acknowledging different sizes of communities, different geographies, and different transportation infrastructure. The third thing was we focused just on trains and the rapid bus system in Connecticut. This was strategic based on the amount of state money that's gone into this infrastructure improvements. We thought this was a really good place to start talking about, that final mile of land use reform that should happen around this infrastructure. But that really isolated the bus ridership in Connecticut. And it's really pretty evenly split between 50 million or 50% on either side. So we thought that kind of limited some of the discussion we had around the transit network, and particularly the types of riders that ride on rail are very different demographically than folks that take buses. Even the COVID numbers really showed that rail ridership went down. It's back up to probably 70% of pre-COVID. Bus ridership dipped, but never dropped off that long. These are folks that are working class or communities of color, or folks that do reverse commutes from urban centers into suburban areas. And it's a demographic we care deeply about, and now we have capacity to incorporate them into our proposal, which we're very excited about. And then the last 2 points, I think, hopefully are very relevant to the audience tonight. Something we absolutely acknowledged in previous organizing and research that we've done is the reality that local capacity, infrastructure limitations are real barriers for folks that really do want to see more development and more diversity of homes in Connecticut. And without really connecting the dots at the state level for all these kind of grants and resources available, it can be very frankly daunting for a community to try to plan, to try to get the kind of right balance of change and status quo and mixes of ideas and really figuring out ways to build, some gentle missing middle density with existing infrastructure capacity. So we think we've addressed that quite a bit. But additionally, local planning commissions and economic development commissions should be partners. We want to try to get involved with folks earlier. And that's kind of why we're doing this exercise with folks to really give a good brief on what we're talking about, how we see this as a collaboration of local and regional and state actors, and how we can help kind of bridge the benefits of state resources without some of the downside, and spur some local conversations, and again, activate the folks that we know are existing in all these communities that want to see some positive changes. So a lot of this work that we've done, really even starting in the last session, we did a number of what we called TOC, transit-oriented community walk audits across the state, where we got local stakeholders from town planners to first selectmen, council members, state reps, even federal reps in some cases, business communities, faith leaders, nonprofit advocates, physically walking around about a dozen train stations and bus stations in Connecticut to understand, particularly communities that have been thinking about transit-oriented development, in some cases activating districts locally and understanding what are the opportunities, what are the challenges, and where can the state play a positive collaborative role, and where can we advocate for that. That's been a really successful program. We actually haven't been able to do one in Shoreline East, so we're kind of thinking about doing one in the weather gets warmer too. So Old Saybrook is obviously on our radar. Guilford is another community we've talked about. So we hope to keep in touch with all of you and maybe do one of these soon. It's been a really great way to kind of see land use patterns, pedestrian safety opportunities, to see some infrastructure improvements around some of these stations. So that's kind of what we really internalized from the last session. We did all these walk audits kind of since then into the fall. We've done a number of research projects around economic development upsides for the sort of transit corridors in Connecticut. We've got a couple of different briefs coming out in the next couple of months that really make this case for the work component of Work, Live, Ride, about how this is really key to economic development in the state, thinking about these transit connections. So our plan for the coming session, as I've sort of teased already, we are calling it Work, Live, Ride. And we're emphasizing the same concept that we did last year around transit-oriented communities, but we've really expanded the focus of the proposal and changed really pretty dramatically how we would try to envision encouraging this kind of change. And really, the Work, Live, Ride wording, this phrase, you're gonna see a lot of this session and beyond. We really think this is hopefully the beginning of a larger conversation about what we want Connecticut to be in the 21st century, and learning from some of the limitations in the 20th century planning, and thinking about this as a vision for a more prosperous, equitable, and sustainable state. Certainly, it's a policy framework we are introducing this session. We think very likely we'll do Work, Live, Ride 1, Work, Live, Ride 2, et cetera, going forward, and really trying to reorient all the different agencies at the state level, thinking about how can we build homes in smart places, connecting jobs and amenities and resources, protecting our natural environment. And finally, probably most importantly, it's hopefully a call to action for pro-homes advocates at the state level and at the local level to see a better vision for your community locally, and getting all these pieces together to encourage more types of homes and more diversity of housing for all ages and colors and economic backgrounds. So we're really hoping that this will continue a lot of our local organizing work in session and outside of the session, really for the next few years. So we're hoping that Work, Live, Ride is something that you'll be very familiar with, excited about, and working closely with over the next few years. I'll give very quickly the framework about what we're doing in contrast to kind of last year. Last year, we talked about mandates. This year, we're talking incentives. And basically, the idea is we're trying to incentivize local planning and development within a designated TOC district, and that could be along a rail line or a bus line, rather than thinking about it strictly as this kind of half-mile bubble around a train station. We want to give way more discretion to communities to think about it as along a commercial corridor. Maybe it's not the train station in Old Saybrook, maybe it's a bus line. It's trying to identify locally where this kind of development could be successful and part of a long-term plan for the development of a community. We want to try to direct discretionary state funding that exists through different grants and different agencies. Right now, it can be kind of difficult to coordinate, as I'm sure a lot of you know. We're trying to kind of reorganize that into 3 buckets. And one bucket is the planning and design emphasis, about actually getting towns that maybe have a little bit of limitations of soil samples, brownfield remediation studies, traffic studies. Those are kind of legitimate barriers that make it harder to build that political will and interest to get stuff built. So we want to have money and funding specifically for that side of it. The second piece of the puzzle is the infrastructure improvements. Again, that could be from site cleanups to pedestrian safety and beautification of streets, to actually building sewer and water extensions and upgrading systems and places that don't have some of that infrastructure. And third, and finally, we also want to see some subsidies for home creation within the district. That could either be at certain levels of affordability, maybe deeper affordability, or leveraging public land. We want to try to incentivize smart, innovative, creative, locally driven ideas about recognizing the assets on the local side that can be leveraged in these districts, and give the P&Zs and town planners more discretion to kind of say, here's what we think, and the state can plug in those gaps of getting that infrastructure built, getting some of that predictability into the market, which can attract private development and really, move the dial on some of these plans that can sometimes have really good intentions, but not necessarily get done or get stuff built. And we all want to coordinate this through the Office of Responsible Growth. That's an office that exists in OPM right now. It's been a little bit sleepy. It's where your affordable housing plans and plans of conservation development, of course, go. For folks on the commissions are familiar already. But we think this is a really good vehicle for playing quarterback on the state agency side. They kind of, on paper, have this authority, but in practice, it's not really enforced, and it's also not really done at the staff or commissioner level. And I can tell you, we've had conversations with every agency that touches this kind of work, and people are very enthusiastic about having this coordination, streamlining these different grant programs, and hopefully topping up a little bit of funding on them as well. So the Office of Responsible Growth is going to be this main contact point for local communities, and really embed land use planners to bring state resources to bear, to learn kind of institutional capacity of best practices for getting this kind of stuff built. And as I said, really bridging the gap in some of this funding and infrastructure and planning that we know, if we bridge that, we can actually get some stuff built. So, what are transit-oriented communities? Very quickly, they center riders, both bike riders and transit riders. They center pedestrians. We've had a rash of pedestrian deaths in this state, which I think is really created a lot more interest in our work. TOCs are great because they offer a diversity of types of homes and jobs. It's not just your single family house on a large lot far from the centers. It's townhouses, it's duplexes, it's apartment buildings, it's home ownership opportunities, it's home rentership opportunities at all different levels of income. Just the nature of allowing more diversity of homes around transit, we think will really enliven the market to meet this demand that we know exists for retiring seniors, for young folks coming, and for this job home gap that we have in the state. And finally, we want to create exciting places and communities and sustainable communities that are more walkable, that are less car driven and car centric. We think, of course, this is good for the environment and good for our immediate spaces, but we just know that these kinds of communities are the most beloved in the state. So we think this concept is very popular. Even the session last year, the bill didn't get through, but I think the acknowledgement that transit-oriented communities is a big piece of the puzzle was universally accepted, which we were very encouraged about. And something to say that maybe be obvious, maybe not, but this idea of New England character is really transit-oriented. Most of the development of our state, from 17th century canals and rivers to 19th century railroads, the most beloved communities, historic centers, dynamic places are transit-oriented to begin with. So this is something deeply tied to the nature of Connecticut, particularly Connecticut as an industrial power. That was the case. And we have that infrastructure in place still, and we have that tradition in place. So we think that this is not proposing something new or radically different. We think, frankly, this is the best parts of New England character that we just want to see again in places that maybe been a little bit left behind in the 20th century, or are waiting for the kind of investment that we know will enliven again some of these communities. The other thing is that today, Connecticut is very transit rich. That might not be the popular perception for a lot of folks that rely on driving, but with bus service, rail, and rapid bus, there are 111 towns and cities served by some level of transit in this state out of 169. That's 2/3 of the communities have some transit infrastructure already. There are 40 million annual rail rides in 2019. That number is coming back up. Probably won't hit the same peak of commuters going down to Grand Central, but that could mean intracity and intrastate travel if we reorient the system and build more homes around the rail ridership. And importantly, there's even more bus ridership in the major CT transit districts and some of the smaller independent systems like in Old Saybrook. There's just a large demographic of people that are public transit riders. It's very different demographics between bus and rail, but it's a huge, huge population, and it could be much larger. We can improve the transit service and infrastructure if we build more homes around this. So we already have the tradition in Connecticut. We already have the infrastructure legacy in Connecticut. So we're not really trying to do a whole lot of new stuff here. We're just putting pieces together. So the idea for work, live, ride, going back to the criticism that we had that one size fits all dynamic, we've gotten far away from that. And the idea here is to really identify different transit networks, different population sizes, and emphasize there. So the three kind of pertinent distinctions that we have: number one, it's a rapid transit community. This is a town or city with at least one rail or rapid bus. This would be Old Saybrook. In this case, we have transit communities, which has a town or city with at least one bus route. And we have transit adjacent communities that don't necessarily have transit, but have commuters that go back and forth relying on that system. I'll talk a little bit more about how this would work specifically for Old Saybrook, but the basic idea, any community that is a rapid transit community, particularly for Old Saybrook being well under 60,000, the idea for this district would be 20 homes per acre as a baseline of the transit district. We're not putting requirements that it's in a half-mile radius of a train station. We're not saying how many acres it has to be, exactly where it works. There's a lot of discretion of where a community can plan for that, but we would want to see 20 homes per acre. We think that density is actually a little bit low for best practices around rapid transit particularly, but again, we think acknowledging their different sizes and different populations, we can't do the same thing in every rapid transit community, and we don't intend to. We'll skip through some of the transit adjacent stuff and get to the process. The basic mechanics of work, live, ride, we're pretty confident this is going to get through. So if this passes in the session, the idea would be the Office of Responsible Growth will kind of get its act together, come out with some guidelines, start getting the process in place. But basically, a community like Old Saybrook, the first action item that you would have is to proactively opt in. It's not a mandate. You're not required to participate in the bill. So it's only up to the community if you want to opt in or not. Opting in would basically just be the highest level of elected office voting to opt into the process. Board of Selectmen would be the case here, I guess. And the idea would be, once you've affirmatively opted into work, live, ride, for a community that doesn't currently have a TOC district, that would basically just start the process of collaborating with the Office of Responsible Growth to start streamlining the planning process, the design process, helping the local community have kind of the best practices of what this kind of nebulous, non-continuous district could look like, how big it could look like reasonably, what the capacity of the community could be, what are some of those pieces of infrastructure or planning design that might be necessary to really get this stuff done. That collaboration with the local planning and zoning and planning office could ultimately take however long, a year, 18 months, whatever that is. But the end point of that would be that the community would then pass a TOD or TOC district at the P&Z level or at the highest board level. So that would be a two-step process for Old Saybrook to say, hey, this could be really cool for us. We want to opt into it, but that doesn't mean all of a sudden we have very specific requirements that are, overtly onerous. This just starts a clock in a collaboration with the state to really see what size district this really works, where this could work in the community, what transit corridor we really want to promote. And basic, the criteria for this, as I said, we're not really defining this as a half mile. It's not a particular number of acres. It really is a lot of flexibility. We're not looking for baseline numbers of acreage per se. We're looking more for reasonable size that really fits in the fabric of a community that can see some kind of as of right development, mixed use, mixed income. Particularly what we're trying to emphasize is the idea of missing middle housing. And that's, the idea of single family housing on one spectrum and really large apartment buildings on the other. That's kind of all you see in Connecticut. That's kind of the way that the zoning works and the economics work. But what we're trying to do with Work, Live, Ride is really emphasize and incentivize that missing middle. It's duplexes, it's, you know, the 3-deckers, it's maybe 5/1 apartment buildings, perfect sixes, smaller scale, 20 homes or less per development. That is that sweet spot of kind of naturally affordable, more diversity of options, smaller footprints, less disruption. We think that's really a sweet spot that is just not really present in the market. A lot of developers just haven't really worked that muscle in Connecticut. So that's really this as a right development in these districts, particularly trying to emphasize this idea of that kind of walkable Main Street community that has housing on top, commercial on the bottom floor. It's smaller scale. It allows for smaller developers and creates more innovation and frankly more competition in the development side, which we think is really a good thing. We wouldn't want to have any onerous parking requirements, no minimum lot sizes. So, you know, if a half acre can support 6 or 8 homes, it should be able to do so. And then no residency restrictions, basically just saying it's not just senior housing, or it's not a family member has to be in the ADU in the backyard, having a little bit more diversity, particularly on the home rentership side. But other types of housing, we want to see more diversity. We also have some affordability requirements based on CHFA, the housing financing agency in Connecticut. They have a housing assessment need program that designates communities as strong markets or weak markets, high opportunity, low opportunity. Old Saybrook has a couple of different distinctions, but it's basically high opportunity and weak or strong market. So in that case, the percentage of affordability would be 18% for developments over 10 homes. So anything below 10 homes in this missing middle, there would be no affordability requirements. Anything over 10 development homes per development would have that 18% put together. So, you know, we think that's the right balance of not putting nothing in. We want to see affordable housing. We want to have more equity in these districts, but we also want to make the numbers work for developers. And there's that balance we think, you know, hits right for that 18% for in Old Saybrook's case. So there are some sticks, mostly carrots with some sticks. But the basic idea is if you don't opt in to Work, Live, Ride, that's fine. You're not forced to do anything. All that would mean is you'd be ineligible as a community for specific discretionary state grants tied to infrastructure. And really, you know, we're talking a little bit of Urban Act, STEEP Act, a couple of those programs. Some towns they're more pertinent than others, but we think the state should be putting resources into communities that do want to see this kind of development. In some cases, if a community, again, just doesn't want to do it, that's fine. If you want to beautify the downtown Main Street, you just have to pay for it yourselves. You can always revisit and come into the Work, Live, Ride. But, you know, we think that that's a fairly reasonable stick. We don't want to create mandates. We don't want to force too much in. So some communities will look at that and say, well, I think we'd be okay without it. We're not ready yet to do this. And that's fine. Some cases, this might be a good conversation starter to look to say, hey, look, we do want to do some of this kind of stuff. So maybe this is something we've talked about. This is a good way to do it. You know, let's avoid this stick and actually be proactive and try to get a lot of state money to actually do some of this stuff. In the case of if you opt in to Work, Live, Ride, you are on the clock to actually pass a TOC district. So, you know, there's a reasonable timeline. There's obviously things that can come up that can delay it. Office of Responsible Growth would be reasonable on that. But the deadline would be at some point to pass a TOC district formally and proactively at the local level. If not, if that doesn't happen in outside of sort of normal, reasonable cases, then the community would be on the hook for paying back any planning money that comes back. That was a big difference for some of the inclusionary housing stuff that's happened in the last 10 years. Again, we think most communities that want to do this proactively want to see this kind of stuff built and want to see these homes built. So we think that's a fairly small piece of the puzzle. And then the final piece, just as a back end, if a community passes something at 20 homes per district or per acre and 2 years wants to lower that density, they just would not be allowed to. There might be some penalties for that. So we want to have a little bit of sticks to make sure we're putting state resources in the right place. But it's mostly the carrot approach to really encourage development and get these projects built at the local level. The office itself, it does not currently have this capacity. We would be asking this session for funding to fund for full-time land use planners, some additional resources that this office could hold for communities. Again, best practices on soil studies, traffic studies, building up this state capacity of knowledge that local communities can really tap into rather than having to reinvent the wheel with at the COG level or at the consultant level, just being able to build a resource hub where these planners are embedded in communities, working very closely, very familiar with the local nuances and planning locally driven districts with the help of state resources. The idea, again, is these three buckets of the Office of Responsible Growth will help on the technical side, and the planning side will help then get communities other discretionary grants, DOT, DECD, DEEP grants to clean up a site, to infrastructure upgrades, whatever that might be, make sure that's all lined up and processed. And then also hopefully getting some grant money for actually subsidy of the development side. That's not something that we've typically done from an advocacy standpoint previously. We're working with a lot of housing advocates to shore up that with other bills in the process, but we think that's should be a piece of the puzzle, trying to lower that cost per unit, particularly for the affordable housing development. And basically the Office of Responsible Growth would have the statutory authority to coordinate all these different agency grants. As many of you know, some of these requirements kind of contradict each other. They might contradict federal grants. All that stuff can be overwhelming and kind of kill the momentum on stuff and scare off development. This office would really be going through systematically and, you know, cutting down tape, expediting processes, getting timelines faster and guaranteed so you can have a predictable development cycle. And so you're not languishing for 3 or 4 years waiting for brownfield funding or trying to get approval that are contradictory between states. We think this is a really important role that this office is already equipped to play and is sort of doing so informally, as we've learned. And a lot of the staff side on different agencies really want to see this kind of opportunity. So going specifically, just to recap kind of what this designation might mean for Old Saybrook, you are a rapid transit community under this designation because of the train station and having some bus lines. So ultimately what we want to see as opting in for Work, Live, Ride is a commitment to building or planning some kind of district at 20 homes per acre with 18% affordability requirements for developments that are over 10 homes. Really beyond that, there isn't any requirement. So it's not a minimum of 500 acres or anything like that. It's not a half-mile footprint around the train station, which might not make sense given the water exposure. So really what this would lead you to is if the board decides to opt in, they can start doing that next year. That would just trigger Office of Responsible Growth, collaborating with the town planning office, economic development, planning and zoning, and start really trying to figure out, you know, is this 100 acres? Is this 200 acres? Is this along, you know, the rail corridors? Is this along a bus corridor? Is there some long neglected part of the community where it's maybe not on the train station, but it's around a bus line that we want to see some development? We think soil wise or density wise, this can happen. You know better than we do. You know better than Office of Responsible Growth. So we really want to just give some baseline guidelines and then allow the P&Z to really form this and get this through and plan this. The Office of Responsible Growth, each step along the process here would provide this technical assistance, provide the streamlining of existing discretionary grant funding, and in some cases, hopefully if we get it passed with some funding in the governor's budget, some discretionary funding in the office itself to actually top up a project if the grant might fall through that. The example I use in conversations, we did a walk audit in Bethel, Connecticut, in upper Fairfield County. They did a great TOC district a couple years ago, got some development already happening. They've got one plot of land on the other side of the rail line, really close to the train station. It's on the Danbury line, but there's no pedestrian crossing. So if they don't have that pedestrian crossing, it's like a 2-mile walk to the nearest crossing to get folks over, which, you know, scares off some developers from actually developing it. So they've done some mapping out of this pedestrian bridge they'd want to do. They've got, you know, one part-time economic development coordinator and planner. So it's hard for them to navigate existing state funding. There's some gaps in place. This particular project would be streamlined by Office of Responsible Growth. They'd find out all the funding, all the approvals, all the oversights. And if there's any gap in that $8 million, we'd hopefully have funding to top it up and get that built. And that would again signal to private developers that this is on a path and start that process too. So that's kind of the perfect case scenario that we think is pretty feasible given the existing infrastructure at the state and the existing programs, but just a little push from this office we think can really make a big difference in a tipping point for local communities. Once in the case of Old Saybrook, once they opt in and once you opt in and start this process. So that's basically the gist of it. I wanted to give a little bit more time for questions and comments and feedback. But I know that's a lot of information I just threw at you. As I said, I'll share the presentation. We'll have some available information on the website very soon. But we're really eager to promote this and have a discussion with folks in Old Saybrook. So I will shut up.
Any questions?
I have a question. Do you have any examples of existing dwelling units near train stations, especially along Shoreline East, let's say, that would meet these criteria?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are pockets of developments, a couple, Clinton has done a couple. I mean, offhand, I'd have to look a little bit closer at Shoreline East. But, certainly we've seen developments along the Hartford line. We've done some walks in Berlin. Meriden even done some cool stuff. Windsor's done some cool stuff and a couple of textile factories. I mentioned Bethel. Even on Metro North, there's been a couple of really good examples. Rowayton Heights and Darien got a really good development. It's actually a case where there's a supermarket and apartments going up right across the station, right across the street from the station. So, wherever possible, we're trying to highlight the fact that this does exist in Connecticut and has some good examples. So, it's not these big developments. It's not the huge 300 unit developments that I think admittedly and perhaps fairly scare people. We are trying to reemphasize historic examples, primarily in a lot of our cities and smaller, community downtowns where there are those triple deckers, those perfect sixes, the nice walkable apartment buildings in the downtown Waterbury Green. So it's a little bit of contemporary stuff getting built that we're trying to highlight, but also trying to dust off the imagination a little bit of some older communities and some older housing stock that meets this criteria that, could serve as an opportunity to think about, modern versions of that stuff.
I have a question. First of all, I really applaud what you put together. It's very encouraging to partner with the partners that you've identified in the state. I'm just wondering, are you a nonprofit, and who funds you now? Are you funded through the state, or are you I noticed on your website there are a lot of you have a lot of support from a lot of sources, but I also read a critical article about your organization, which was that
real estate shills.
So anyway, could you talk a little bit more about how you're funded, and are you a state employee or part of the state agency, or
yeah, happy to talk about that. And we have our annual report that just came out too. I can share Chris afterwards with the presentation. Yeah, this kind of came up last year. We got, I sort of joke, it's not exactly QAnon level conspiracy, but it's not far from that, where there were some attempts to kind of make us into, I don't know, some big special interest or some real estate shill. But the basic gist, we're a nonprofit. Sarah Bronin started this organization in 2020. It was all volunteer. We approached the Regional Plan Association as a fiscal sponsor. They've done this kind of sponsorship of nonprofit groups in previous iterations across the tri-state area. So that happened pretty early in 2020 when, the Eastern Connecticut Community Foundation and others wanted to fund the zoning atlas and some other stuff. So that started our kind of nonprofit entity right around the time that I came on actually as a volunteer. Sarah had been nominated, now she just got confirmed a week ago, to lead this historic preservation group at the federal level. So the question was what do we do with Desegregate CT? I kind of came on at the right time and was really interested in helping kind of grow the organization. So the thought process then was, do we try to launch as an independent nonprofit and kind of incorporate and start all of that work, or do we continue the relationship with the Regional Plan Association and become a program of theirs? And just from the fundraising to really launch an independent organization, we thought it made more sense to actually stay with RPA. So a quick word about RPA. It's a 100-year-old organization. It's a nonprofit that's in education, research, and advocacy, based in New York, but it's been involved in the tri-state area, New Jersey and Connecticut for 100 years. There's actually a really cool exhibit coming up, starting at a couple of community colleges in Connecticut, talking about the centennial of RPA in Connecticut particularly. I think it's starting in Bridgeport next month. But they were historically, once a generation, created these kind of regional plans, primarily early on focused on transportation infrastructure. The Merritt Parkway was something that they advocated for back in the day. More recently, in 2017, I think, was the most recent plan, and that outlined housing development, environmental sustainability, good governance, as well as sort of transportation infrastructure and upgrades. And part of that plan was emphasizing a lot more of housing development. So that was kind of the symbiotic relationship for Desegregate and RPA. So I'm an employee of the Regional Plan Association, but the way that it works, we are an independent budget. All of our money comes from either community foundations in Connecticut or an organization called Open Philanthropy that funds a lot of land use stuff. I can very emphatically, confidently say we're not real estate shills. We don't take money from real estate. As far as I've been here, we haven't been asked. And I think that's an important point of this. Whether it's good faith confusion or some bad faith, we just don't want to see change, so we're going to discredit the messenger. People sometimes, not just in Connecticut, elsewhere, about land use reform, say, well, of course, you've got to be shills for real estate because real estate would benefit from this. And the reality is way more complicated. There are lots of real estate developers that are opposed to the Pro Homes vision for pretty simple reasons, that they are established in this kind of hard network of getting stuff built. They know how to operate in communities. They navigate these approval processes of the financing. So they're fine with the status quo of making it hard to build stuff. They don't want competition. So they don't want to see a lot of changes. And not for nothing, on the back end, housing scarcity raises prices, it raises commissions. There's a lot to be gained from a scarcity of housing in that industry. So, as far as I know, the only endorsement the Connecticut Realtors Association made last cycle was actually for our leading opponent, a representative in Greenwich, who actually lost. So, we saw that op-ed too, and that's going to be on social media sometimes, but it's pretty simple. We're an independent nonprofit. We're in advocacy, we're in research. We are pro homes and building homes, but we don't take support from the real estate industry. Typically, we don't even really advocate at the individual project level. If anyone's on our newsletter, we don't typically say, hey, there's a 60-unit development coming down on Essex Crossing or something, and go check it out. Like, occasionally we'll do that if it seems to be really within our wheelhouse of TOC and otherwise, but we're not advocating for any particular developer, any particular type of home. We want to see more competition. We want to see particularly more small scale development. Again, this missing middle thing I talked about, it just doesn't exist in the real estate industry right now. And again, there's some forces that kind of want to see it stay that way. And we don't. We want to see more competition, more open resources for that. So, I can send you our annual report that shows kind of where we get our funding from. RPA is different. They have a different board and all of that, but we run independently. That was part of the deal. They provide a lot of research resources and obviously credibility in terms of being in Connecticut for 100 years. So it's been a good relationship for us, but we operate very independently. And I'll just say on a personal level, I'm like a democratic socialist tenant organizer from New York City, where I was out protesting Blackstone and other big developers over the years. So I probably wouldn't be in an organization that's a front for real estate interests. I want to see more homes, more affordable homes. Some of that's private sector, some of that's public sector, some of it's public-private sector. We need all the above. We're very sincere in that.
If you could send us an annual report, that would be great, and it could be shared with the commissions.
Yeah, it's on the website right now, but I'll share it in the email with the presentation. So you have that resource. One of our biggest supporters has been the Eastern Connecticut Community Foundation. I don't think we'd exist without them. They helped fund the Zoning Atlas, the first research project that we did, and have been a big supporter of ours. And frankly, we're really grateful for that relationship. So, we really rely a lot on the community foundations in Connecticut.
Thank you.
If there's anyone online, you can use the raise hand function to ask questions.
And just one other announcement is this right now is a joint meeting of planning, zoning and EDC. There's a few people on here for the zoning meeting tonight. So you may get bumped off. And we're gonna go switch rooms and you'll just connect back on the link and we'll start that meeting at 7. So you're in the right place here. Just really appreciate that.
Any other questions for the presenter?
Michael Bender here. I was curious about how this would relate to like the 8-30G affordable housing requirements we're underneath now. Is this proposed to like replace them, work alongside them? It seems like it's similar goals, but different mechanics in there.
Yeah, I mean, I 830G is obviously a controversial piece of the puzzle. I think of it as separate. I mean, it's not replacing 830G. It's not doing anything one way or the other for it. I know there's some discussion of potentially tweaking it in the legislature this year. I think even us that support the goals of 830G, there probably are opportunities to improve that, but that's not really the intention of Work, Live, Ride. So I think they're kind of separate things ultimately. But we'll kind of see how that plays out with what legislators want to do or don't want to do. But it's been hard to get stuff built, as we know, and 830G is not a perfect nuanced tool, but in terms of allowing stuff to get built that wouldn't get built, it's certainly doing that. But I think there's some pretty good faith criticisms that folks certainly, locally would have that I'm sympathetic to, but it's just, they're kind of separate things from our standpoint.
Anything else? Can I entertain a motion to adjourn? Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor? Thank you very much. Appreciate the information you presented.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for putting this joint meeting together and letting me zoom in. So, thanks for all the hard work that you all do locally as well. And certainly hope to have some more conversations about this in the near future. So thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thanks.
Thank you.